The cold reached him before the light did. It crept into his bones as he sat near the dying fire, breath rising in pale clouds that vanished as quickly as they formed. Night still clung to the mountains, heavy and unmoving, as if dawn had forgotten this place entirely. Above him, jagged ridgelines cut the sky into sharp, black shapes. Below, the valley lay silent, buried beneath layers of frost and shadow. Silence was the reason he stayed. The unnamed man lived where sound had to work to survive, where wind scraped through pine needles like dull blades, where stones shifted under snow with quiet patience, where nothing spoke unless it had something important to say. He had built his shelter with his own hands, weathered tarp, scavenged timber, ropes stiff with age and ice. It was barely enough. That was the point. Comfort made people careless. He crouched near the fire pit, feeding it a thin branch, listening to the weak crackle as damp wood resisted flame. His fingers were swollen and scarred, nails cracked from cold and labor. Every movement was practiced, efficient. Wasted effort meant wasted heat. Wasted heat meant pain. Behind him, the dog stirred. She was a German shepherd, older now, muzzle graying, movements slower than they once were. But her eyes, sharp, amber, watchful, had lost none of their clarity. She rose without a sound, pattered across the dirt, and circled the edge of the camp the way she did every morning. Not searching for danger, confirming its absence. The man didn't turn. He trusted her more than his own senses. They had been alone together for years. Long enough that words felt unnecessary. Long enough that her presence filled the space where human voices once lived. He didn't remember when he stopped talking out loud. At some point, the mountains became better listeners than people ever were. The dog paused. Not at the tree line, not at the trail, at the fire pit. She lowered her head, sniffed once, then nudged something with her nose. A soft click sounded as it rolled across stone and dirt, stopping near the man's boot. He frowned and looked down. It was just a rock, pale gray, about the size of a clenched fist, resting where it hadn't been before. He was certain of that. He kept his camp small, controlled. Nothing entered it without his knowing. That was how he survived, by noticing things before they became problems. The dog nudged it again, more carefully this time, then looked up at him. Not expectant, not excited, intent. He exhaled slowly, irritation prickling beneath his calm. "You're bored," he muttered, voice rough from disuse. "That's all." She didn't move. With a sigh, he bent and picked up the stone. The first thing he noticed was the weight. It was heavier than it should have been, dense in a way that didn't match its size. The second was the surface, too smooth, as if it had been worn not by water, but by hands. His thumb brushed over it, wiping away dirt, and something beneath caught the weak firelight. A faint gleam, not bright, not obvious, just enough to make his chest tighten. He scowled and turned it over, inspecting it like a man determined to find a flaw. Mountains were full of strange rocks. Quartz, mica, fool's gold. People who didn't know better called everything a miracle. He had learned the cost of believing in miracles. The dog sat beside him, tail still, eyes tracking the stone as if it mattered. That unsettled him more than the stone itself. "Coincidence," he said, more to himself than to her. He placed it on a flat rock near the fire, deliberately casual, and stood. Don't start making stories out of nothing. Stories were dangerous. Stories led to hope. Hope led to mistakes. He turned away, busying himself with breaking down camp for the morning, rolling the blanket, checking his traps, scanning the tree line. The stone stayed where he left it, silent, unassuming. But he felt it, not like a sound or a touch, more like a thought he hadn't invited. When the sun finally crested the ridge, it did so reluctantly, light spilling into the valley in thin, brittle lines. Frost glittered across the ground, turning dirt and pine needles into a field of tiny stars. The man straightened, stretching stiff muscles, and allowed himself one moment to breathe it in. Morning always felt honest. Night could lie. The dog moved ahead of him, sniffing the air, then stopped abruptly near the shelter entrance. He followed her gaze. Another stone lay there, smaller than the first, darker, almost black. It rested on the frozen ground as if placed deliberately, positioned just where his foot would land when he stepped out. His stomach dropped. He stood very still, every sense sharpening. He scanned the trees, the ridges, the narrow paths he knew as well as his own scars. Nothing moved. No tracks marred the frost. No sign of intrusion. The dog approached the stone slowly, tail low, not fearful, but serious. She nudged it once, then stepped back, looking at him. The man swallowed. This wasn't play. This wasn't chance. He picked it up, feeling that same wrongness pulse through his palm. The weight, the smoothness, and beneath the surface, that subtle, unnatural suggestion of light. He closed his fingers around it and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Curiosity stirred, sharp and unwelcome. He hated it immediately, because curiosity was how it started last time. A question he shouldn't have asked. A risk he didn't need to take. A choice that had cost him everything except this. This cold, hard, quiet life carved out of stone and discipline. He placed the second stone beside the first, farther from the fire this time, as if distance alone could dull their presence. The dog laid down at his feet, pressing her side against his leg. Solid, warm, real. He rested a hand on her head, grounding himself in the steady rhythm of her breathing. Nothing changes, he said softly, though doubt threaded the words. We keep going. Same as always. The stones didn't answer. But as the sun climbed higher and the mountains watched in their ancient, indifferent way, unease settled into his chest like something waking up after a long sleep. Because the mountain had given him something. And mountains never gave without reason. The next morning, the dog brought another stone. She appeared from the trees just after dawn, breath fogging the air, paws silent against frost. She didn't run or wag her tail. She walked straight toward the fire pit and lowered her head, placing the stone carefully beside the others before sitting back on her haunches. As if completing a task, the man watched from the edge of his shelter, jaw tight, arms folded against the cold. He hadn't slept well. The night had been restless, wind shifting direction, branches snapping in the dark, the memory of that faint gleam refusing to leave him alone. He told himself it was nothing, that the mountain was full of tricks for tired minds. Still, his eyes went immediately to the new stone. This one was irregular, its surface rough in places and polished smooth in others, like something half-finished. When the weak sunlight touched it, a muted shimmer stirred beneath the grime. Not bright enough to call attention to itself, just enough to be noticed by someone who knew what to look for. He felt his pulse quicken despite himself. Enough, he muttered, more sharply than he intended. The dog's ears twitched, but she didn't move. He crouched and gathered the stones into his hands, 3 now, and carried them to the far side of the camp, placing them near a fallen log where he wouldn't have to look at them. He turned his back on them deliberately, as though denial were a form of control. It didn't help. By the 3rd day, there were 5 stones. By the 5th, 9. They varied in size and shape, some dull and rough, others strangely smooth, but all shared the same unsettling weight, the same quiet presence. And always, the dog delivered them with care, setting them near the fire pit or at the shelter entrance, never tossing them, never treating them like toys. The pile grew. So did his unease. He began to watch her more closely. Where she went, how long she was gone, whether she followed the same path each time. But she moved through the mountains the way she always had, confident, purposeful, vanishing into terrain he trusted her to understand better than he did. On the 6th evening, he gave in. He chose one of the stones, the palest, the one that caught the light most readily, and carried it to the stream. Kneeling, he dipped it into the icy water and rubbed at the surface with his thumb, scraping away layers of dirt and moss. What emerged beneath made his breath hitch. The stone's interior caught the fading light, refracting it in subtle, fractured lines. Not glass, not quartz, something denser, older. His fingers stilled as recognition stirred, unwelcome and undeniable. Memory rose with it. A temporary job, years ago. A mining outpost tucked into a canyon far from here. He'd needed money then, badly. He'd told himself it would be quick, harmless, just labor. But he remembered the geologist, an older man with careful hands and a habit of explaining things no one had asked about. Pressure, the man had said, holding a sample to the sun. Time, darkness. That's how the valuable things are made. Not fast, not gently. The man by the stream now swallowed hard. He turned the stone slowly, noting the structure, the way the light bent within it. The signs were unmistakable. He didn't know exact names anymore, didn't want to, but he knew enough. This wasn't ordinary. This was dangerous. He dropped the stone back into the water as if it had burned him and stood abruptly, scanning the treeling. His heart pounded. The silence suddenly too thin, too fragile. Wealth meant attention. Attention meant people. And people meant betrayal. He had learned that lesson once. He would not learn it again. That night, he barely slept. Every sound became a threat. The wind whispering through branches sounded like footsteps. A rock shifting downslope made his muscles tense. Hand drifting toward the rusted knife he kept within reach. He dreamed of voices calling his name, of hands reaching for things that weren't theirs to take. He woke to the dog's low growl. She stood at the edge of the camp, body rigid, ears forward, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. He rose silently, heart hammering, and joined her, both of them listening. Nothing came. No intruders. No movement. Just the mountains breathing around them, patient and ancient. Still, the paranoia lingered. By morning, another stone waited near the fire. He stared at it for a long time before picking it up. This one was heavier than any before, darker too. Its surface almost metallic beneath the dirt. He felt a chill run through him that had nothing to do with the cold. "This isn't luck," he whispered. The dog pressed against his leg, steady and warm. He considered leaving, packing up and moving farther into the range, away from whatever this was. But the thought brought no relief. Mountains held secrets everywhere. Running didn't erase them. And then there was the dog. She wasn't randomly collecting stones. She was bringing these stones. From somewhere specific. Somewhere he hadn't seen yet. That realization settled into him slowly, heavily. The rest of the day passed in tense silence. He ate little, eyes tracking every movement, every shift of light across the ground. The stones sat in a growing cluster near the shelter, impossible to ignore now. They felt like a countdown. As dusk fell, the dog stood abruptly and looked at him. Not toward the trees. At him. She took a few steps away, paused, then looked back again, tail low but insistent. "No," he said reflexively. "We're not going anywhere." She didn't move. The mountains darkened around them, shadows stretching long and deep. The man felt something twist in his chest, fear mixed with a reluctant pull he didn't want to name. Some discoveries didn't feel like gifts. They felt like warnings. The dog took another step, then another, finally turning and walking toward a narrow trail he rarely used, one that led into rougher, unfamiliar terrain. The man hesitated only a moment. Then he grabbed his jacket, tightened his grip on the knife, and followed her into the darkening trees. The trail the dog chose was not one he knew. That alone set his nerves on edge. It cut away from the familiar routes he'd walked for years, threading into steeper ground where the mountain rose in uneven shelves of rock and thin, wind-twisted pines. The light faded quickly here, swallowed by ridges that blocked the last of the sun. Cold gathered in pockets along the slope, sharp enough to sting his lungs with every breath. The dog moved ahead of him with purpose, but not confidence. Her tail stayed low. Her ears flicked constantly, tracking sounds he couldn't hear. She stopped often, sniffing the air, then the ground, as if confirming something she already knew and didn't like. "Easy," he murmured, though his own voice sounded thin in the thickening quiet. They climbed for nearly an hour, boots crunching softly over frost and loose gravel. The ground felt different beneath his feet, less solid, more uncertain. He adjusted his weight carefully, testing each step before committing to it. Then the dog stopped abruptly. She stood at the edge of a shallow depression near the base of a fractured boulder, body rigid, ears pinned back. A low whine escaped her throat, soft, tense, nothing like the eager sound she made when she'd brought him the stones. Fear, not discovery. He moved to her side and followed her gaze. At first, he saw nothing but disturbed earth. Soil that looked recently shifted, darker than the surrounding ground, threaded with thin cracks that spidered outward. He crouched slowly, heart pounding, and brushed his gloved fingers across the surface. The ground shifted, just slightly, enough to make his stomach drop. He froze, weight still, listening as a faint settling sound echoed beneath his boots, a whisper of movement deep below the surface. The mountain wasn't solid here. It was loosening, inch by inch, as if something beneath it had begun to breathe again. Carefully, he brushed away more soil. Small fragments gleamed faintly in the dim light. Not whole stones like the ones the dog had carried, but broken pieces, edges exposed where the earth had failed to hold them any longer. His breath hitched. This wasn't chance. This wasn't the dog randomly finding treasures scattered across the mountainside. This was exposure. A hidden deposit, buried for centuries, slowly revealing itself as the mountain shifted and cracked under time and weather. The stones hadn't been found. They had surfaced. The dog pawed the ground once, then retreated quickly, hackles raised. She didn't like this place. Her instinct was clear now. She hadn't been offering him gifts. She'd been warning him. The realization sent a chill through him deeper than the cold. If the mountain was moving, it wasn't just revealing stone. It was becoming unstable. Landslides, sinkholes, sudden collapse. He had seen it once before, had watched an entire section of earth give way in a roar of dust and noise that swallowed machines and men alike. The memory rose unbidden. The mine. He'd trusted the wrong people back then. Trusted that corners wouldn't be cut. Trusted that safety mattered more than profit. He'd been young, desperate, eager to believe that hard work would be enough. It hadn't been. He remembered the shouting, the alarms that came too late, the look on a man's face when the ground betrayed him, shock, then nothing at all. All because someone wanted to extract more, faster. Because greed spoke louder than caution. He had walked away from that life carrying guilt heavier than any stone. Now the mountain stood before him, repeating the same lesson. He straightened slowly, scanning the slope, noting the subtle signs he'd ignored before. Cracks in the earth, trees leaning at unnatural angles, rocks that didn't quite sit where they should. The land was shifting, restless. Staying silent wouldn't keep him safe. It would make him a target or a victim. The dog pressed against his leg, trembling slightly, eyes fixed on the unstable ground. He rested a hand on her head, feeling her fear echo his own. "I know," he whispered. "I see it now." They retreated carefully, moving downslope with deliberate steps, not turning their backs until the dangerous ground lay hidden behind a bend in the trail. Only then did he allow himself to breathe fully. Back at camp, he sat by the fire long after night fell, staring into the flames without seeing them. The stones lay nearby, dull and silent, their presence heavier now that he understood what they represented. Wealth, risk, attention, and beneath it all, danger. He could stay, pretend none of this existed. Hope the mountain would settle, that the stones would stop surfacing, that no one else would wander into the wrong place at the wrong time. Or he could act. The thought of returning to town made his chest tighten. The stares, the questions, the careful way people watched others when money entered the room. He had built his life around avoiding that scrutiny, that pressure. But isolation had limits. For the first time in years, he imagined what would happen if he misstepped alone out there. If the ground collapsed, if the mountain shifted suddenly. No one would know. No one would come. Silence would swallow him just as surely as stone. He looked down at the dog, who met his gaze steadily despite her fear. "You didn't bring these for yourself," he said quietly. "You brought them because you knew." She rested her head on his knee, as if confirming it. The decision formed slowly, reluctantly, like ice sealing over water. He would go down the mountain. He would tell someone. Not for the stones, not for whatever value they carried, but because ignoring the truth had already cost too much once. He packed through the night, movements careful and restrained. Only what he needed: food, blanket, knife. The stones went into a small pouch, wrapped and hidden beneath layers of fabric. Not treasure, evidence. When dawn came, pale and brittle, he stood at the edge of his camp and looked back one last time. The mountains were quiet, unreadable, ancient. Isolation had protected him, until it didn't. With the dog at his side, he turned and began the long descent toward the world he had abandoned, carrying with him the weight of what was buried, and why it could no longer stay that way. The town felt louder than he remembered, not in sound alone, but in presence. Doors slamming, engines idling, voices overlapping in ways the mountains never allowed. Every noise seemed to look at him, to ask where he had come from and why he didn't belong anymore. He walked with his head down, coat pulled tight, the dog pressed close to his leg. People noticed them immediately. His worn boots, his layered, weather-beaten clothes, the shepherd's sharp eyes and disciplined stride. A few stares lingered too long. Others flicked away quickly, uncomfortable with what they couldn't place. He felt exposed in a way the cold had never managed. They entered a small public building near the town center. Plain, functional, the kind of place meant to impose order on uncertainty. The air inside smelled of disinfectant and old paper. Too clean, too controlled. The dog hesitated at the threshold. He felt it before he saw it. Her muscles tensed, ears flicking back and forth, scanning. She didn't like this place. He rested a hand on her neck, grounding them both, and stepped forward. It took time before he spoke. Too much time. He sat across from a desk, fingers laced together, eyes fixed on a scuffed patch of linoleum. The words he'd practiced on the walk down the mountain refused to come. Saying them out loud made everything real. Finally, he reached into his coat and placed the pouch on the desk. "I found something," he said quietly. The stones spilled out one by one, catching the overhead light in muted flashes. The man behind the desk stiffened. He didn't reach for them immediately. He just stared, recognition dawning slowly, then sharply. Others were called. Questions followed. "Where did you get these? How many are there? Does anyone else know?" He answered carefully, offering truth without invitation. He spoke of the mountains, of his dog finding the stones, of unstable ground. He left out the parts that felt too raw, the guilt, the past, the reasons he had chosen silence over safety for so long. The dog lay at his feet, alert and unmoving. When they confirmed the stone's value, he felt nothing resembling relief. No triumph, no excitement, only a tightening in his chest as he watched understanding shift into interest, an interest into risk. "They're significant," one of them said carefully. "But more concerning is what you're describing geologically." They wanted to see the site. The request landed heavily between them. His first instinct was refusal. That place was his home, his refuge. Bringing others there felt like betrayal, like inviting noise into a silence he had spent years protecting. But the image of shifting ground rose again in his mind. The cracks, the dog's fear. "I'll take you," he said at last. "But you move carefully." The return to the mountain felt wrong from the start. The vehicle couldn't go far, forcing them to continue on foot. Boots unfamiliar with the terrain slipped on frost. Voices carried too loudly. The dog walked ahead, tense, scanning constantly, pausing often to look back at him as if to confirm he was still there. As they neared the site, the air changed. Wind funneled through the trees in uneven bursts, carrying a low, unsettled sound from deep within the mountain. He felt it in his chest before he saw it. The ground had shifted again. The shallow depression had widened. The soil pulled apart into a visible crack that ran like a wound through the earth. Small stones tumbled intermittently into the darkness below, disappearing without sound. The dog froze, then backed away quickly, whining. As if in response, the ground shifted further. A sharp crack echoed through the trees. One of the men stumbled, barely catching himself before sliding toward the fracture. Everyone froze, breath held, as the mountain seemed to settle again, quiet but changed. No one spoke for a long moment. Then someone exhaled shakily. This could go at any time. The weight of it settled over them all. This wasn't a resource waiting to be claimed. It was a warning. The conversations changed after that. Words like extraction and value faded, replaced by assessments and safety protocols. They marked the area, stepping carefully, speaking in lowered voices as though the mountain might hear them. They halted any immediate plans. As they prepared to leave, one of them approached him, expression serious but respectful. "You did the right thing bringing this to us," she said. "If you'd stayed quiet." He finished the thought silently. The dog moved to his side, pressing against him, solid and warm. He rested a hand on her back, realization settling into him with quiet force. She had known. Every stone she'd brought him had been an attempt to pull him toward the truth before the mountain forced it on him. She hadn't been collecting wealth. She'd been marking danger. She had saved him, not once, but repeatedly. As they descended, the mountain loomed behind them, altered but still immense, still ancient. He felt the loss of it already, the certainty that things would never be as simple as before. But beneath that loss, something else stirred. Relief. The silence he'd clung to had protected him for years. But it had also blinded him to the risks he could no longer face alone. Sometimes the truth didn't arrive as freedom. Sometimes it arrived disguised as loss. They did not force him to leave. That surprised him more than anything else. There were conversations, careful and deliberate. Offers made without pressure. Temporary shelter in town. Monitoring of the mountain. Protection, if he wanted it. Options laid out plainly, without the sharp edge of authority he had expected. Options meant choice. Choice meant responsibility. He spent one last morning on the ridge above his camp before descending for good, at least for now. The air was clear and thin, the kind that sharpened thought as much as it chilled the skin. Below him, the valley stretched wide and quiet, layers of pine and stone fading into pale blue distance. The mountain was still beautiful, still dangerous, still honest. He walked slowly along the ridge, boots finding familiar purchase, the dog pacing beside him with unhurried calm. She seemed different now, less tense, less alert, as if some burden had lifted the moment he stopped pretending nothing was wrong. He paused where the ground rose slightly, the place where he had often stood to watch storms roll in. He remembered nights huddled beneath his shelter, listening to wind and snow batter the world outside, telling himself that survival was enough. That silence was safety. That distance was strength. Fear had shaped that belief. Fear of greed. Fear of betrayal. Fear of becoming complicit in harm again. He reached into his coat and took out the pouch. The stones rested heavily in his palm. In the morning light, they no longer looked magical, no longer mysterious. Just fragments of pressure and time. Beautiful, yes, but stripped of illusion. They were not treasures. They were reminders. Reminders of what happened when people mistook value for meaning. When they listened to profit instead of warning. When they stayed quiet because speaking felt dangerous. He knelt and placed the pouch gently on the ground, not abandoning it, not claiming it, simply acknowledging it for what it was. Evidence. Responsibility. Truth. The dog sat beside him, leaning into his shoulder. Her presence was steady, unquestioning. She had never asked him to be different than he was, only to see what stood in front of him. "I know," he said softly, resting his forehead against hers. "I'm listening now." The wind moved through the trees below, not whispering this time, but breathing, slow, even, patient. The mountain did not resent him for leaving. It did not demand ownership. It asked only respect, and that he could give. The descent felt different than the climb had days before. His steps were no lighter, his future no clearer, but the weight inside his chest had shifted. Fear still walked with him, but it no longer led. At the edge of the trail, where the land widened and the sounds of the world returned, he stopped once more. The mountain stood behind him, unchanged in its vastness, but altered in meaning. He wasn't abandoning it. He was choosing to stay alive. In town, arrangements were made. Temporary lodging, regular check-ins, a plan that respected both safety and solitude. No one asked him to explain his past. No one tried to reshape him into something more acceptable. They let him be. That was the hardest part to accept. On the first evening indoors, he stood by a window and watched the light fade over rooftops instead of ridges. The dog lay nearby, asleep for the first time in days without tension coiled beneath her ribs. He understood then that accepting help did not mean surrender. It meant allowing space for survival to become something more than endurance. Weeks later, when he returned briefly to the mountain under supervision, it felt different. Not smaller, not weaker, just honest. The dangerous areas were marked. The land was watched, not exploited. The stones were cataloged, not chased. The mountain was no longer a secret. And secrets, he had learned, were heavier than truth. As he walked back down the path for the last time that season, the dog beside him, he felt something close to peace. Not the fragile kind built on isolation, but the steadier kind that came from knowing he did not have to face everything alone. Strength, he realized, wasn't surviving in silence. It was knowing when silence stopped being safe. The dog glanced up at him as they reached the clearing, tail moving once, slow and content. He smiled faintly and continued forward, ready, at last, to carry both solitude and connection in equal measure. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that sometimes what we fear most is the truth calling us back, then take a moment to like this video. Share your thoughts in the comments. Would you have stayed on the mountain or walked back toward the world? And subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Stories about hidden truths, quiet courage, and the treasures we don't always recognize at first. Because not all treasure shines, and not all survival means standing alone.